I used to think the worst day of my life would look loud. Sirens, maybe, slammed doors. I never imagined it would sound like organ music. My name is Ethan Marsh, and 3 months ago I was sitting in the third pew of Grace Hollow Church, holding my daughter's christening gown, telling myself the knot in my stomach was just a father's nerves. I told myself that a lot that year. It's a useful lie when you don't want to look at the truth sitting across the dinner table from you every night, smiling at you with your wife's mouth. My wife's name is Rachel. We had been married for 6 years. Our daughter Nora was 5 months old, and this was supposed to be the day we dedicated her to God in front of everyone who mattered to us. My parents, Rachel's mother, my business partner. Half the congregation that had watched Rachel and me grow up in that church since we were teenagers. And Pastor Michael Grant, of course. Rachel's pastor since she was a little girl. The man who counseled us before our wedding. The man who baptized Nora in his own hands 2 minutes before he destroyed my life in front of 200 witnesses. I need you to understand something about me before I keep going. I am not a man who explodes. I never have been. My father used to say I had ice water where other men had blood, and for most of my life I thought that was an insult. That morning, it became the only thing that saved me. Because 3 weeks before the baptism, I had already found the receipts. Literally. A hotel receipt in the inside pocket of Rachel's coat, dated a Tuesday she told me she was at a prenatal yoga class. I didn't yell. I didn't confront her over the receipt. I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I got quiet. And I got thorough. I hired a private investigator 2 days later. Not because I wanted proof for a fight, because I wanted proof for a future. My future. And Nora's. Within a week, I had photographs. Within 2 weeks, I had phone records. And exactly 4 days before the baptism, I had something I hadn't even gone looking for. A paternity lab confirming what a small, cold voice in me had already suspected the moment I saw Rachel and Pastor Grant standing a little too close, a little too long, at the church picnic 8 months earlier. I sat in my car outside the lab that day, and I did not cry. I made a phone call to my attorney instead. Then I drove home, kissed my daughter's forehead, and put the folder in a drawer, and I waited. Because I already knew where I wanted the truth to land. Not in a kitchen, not in a lawyer's office. I wanted it to land exactly where it had been built, in front of the same people who would have believed every lie either of them ever told. So I smiled at the baptism rehearsal. I shook Pastor Grant's hand. I let Rachel pick out my tie. And on the morning of the ceremony, I sat in the front pew with a manila envelope inside my jacket, and I watched my wife glow in a soft blue dress, and I watched Michael Grant adjust his robe at the altar, and I thought, neither of you has any idea what's in my pocket. The church was full. Standing room in the back. Nora was quiet in my arms, dressed in white lace that had been my grandmother's. Rachel stood beside me, radiant, accepting compliments like a woman with nothing to hide. My mother squeezed my hand before the service started and whispered, "You look tired, honey." I told her I hadn't slept well. That, at least, was true. The ceremony began exactly as it should. Pastor Grant read the liturgy. He poured the water over Nora's head. And for one unbearable second, I watched his hand rest against my daughter's skull, and I made myself breathe. He said the words. The congregation said, "Amen." And then, instead of stepping back to hand Nora to the godparents like the program said he would, Pastor Grant lifted both hands toward the congregation and asked everyone to remain seated for a moment. He said he had, in his words, a joy he could no longer keep to himself. I remember the sound of Rachel's breath catching beside me. I remember thinking, So, this is how she wanted it to happen. Some of you know, Pastor Grant said, his voice thick with something that might have been nerves or might have been performance, that this congregation is like a family to me. And today, on this beautiful day, I want to share news that fills my heart. He looked at Rachel, not at me, at Rachel. Rachel and I are expecting a child together. There was a silence in that room I will remember until the day I die. Not shock, exactly. Something closer to the air being pulled out of a space all at once. Somewhere behind me, my mother made a small, wounded sound. Rachel's own mother stood halfway up from her pews and sat back down like her legs had stopped working. And Rachel, my wife, holding our 5-month-old daughter's blanket in her hands. Rachel did not deny it. She stood there with tears already sliding down her face, nodding like a woman finally set free of a weight, not realizing she had just dropped it directly onto mine, in front of everyone I had ever loved. I did not stand up right away. I want you to understand that. I let it sit in the room for 3, 4, 5 full seconds, long enough that people started turning around in their pews to look at me, waiting for me to break. Long enough that Michael Grant's confident smile started to falter at the edges, because a humiliated man is supposed to look humiliated, and I did not. Then I stood up. I handed Nora to her godmother without a word because whatever happened next, my daughter did not need to be in my arms for it. I buttoned my jacket. I walked to the center aisle and then up the 2 steps to the altar, close enough that Pastor Grant's smile finally died completely. "Ethan," he said, and for the first time that morning, his voice shook. "Let's not here. You just told 200 people you're having a baby with my wife," I said. My voice did not rise. I made sure of that. I had practiced this moment in my head more times than I could count, and I was not going to let anger take it away from me now that it was finally here. I think here is exactly where this belongs. Rachel was crying harder now, reaching toward me. "Ethan, please. I wanted to tell you. I didn't know how." "You didn't need to tell me," I said, still looking at Michael Grant. I already knew. That was the moment his face changed. Not guilt. He'd already worn guilt for the last several minutes, the practiced, tearful guilt of a man who thinks confession absolves him if it's public enough. This was different. This was fear. Because a guilty man confessing expects forgiveness, or at least drama he can control. He does not expect a quiet husband already 3 steps ahead of him. I reached into my jacket and took out the envelope. Someone in the back pews actually gasped audibly, the kind of sound you only hear in movies, except this was real, and it was my life. And my daughter was 5 months old and being held by a woman named Carol, who had known me since I was 12 years old, and her hands were shaking almost as much as Rachel's. "What is that?" Rachel said. Not really a question, more like a plea for it not to be what she already suspected. "This," I said, holding the envelope out toward Michael Grant, "is a paternity and DNA analysis, dated 11 days ago. I let that sit. It's not about the baby you just announced, Pastor. That one's still cooking. Congratulations, by the way, on your timing." I turned the envelope so the congregation could see the sealed lab logo on the front, then looked at Rachel. "This one's about Nora." The church went silent in a way that felt physical, like the air itself had thickened. "I had it done 4 days ago," I continued, "because 8 months ago at the summer picnic, I watched the 2 of you stand a little too close for a little too long, and something in me finally stopped making excuses for what my eyes were seeing. So I hired someone. I found the hotel receipts, Rachel. The Tuesdays that weren't yoga. I found 14 months of phone records showing calls at 11 at night, 12 at night, 1 in the morning to a number saved in your phone as Bible Study Group. My voice did not break. I want you to understand that. I had cried already alone in my car weeks earlier. I had done my grieving in private, the way I do everything. What was left in me standing at that altar was not grief. It was clarity. And when I found all of that, I said, turning the envelope over in my hands, I didn't confront you. I didn't want to fight I could lose in a kitchen with no witnesses, where you'd cry and I'd feel guilty for even asking. I wanted the truth to come out exactly where you'd feel safest telling your lies, in front of the people who trust you both. So I waited. I let you plan this whole beautiful morning. I even let you pick out my tie, Rachel. I looked at the tie for half a second, a small, cold detail that suddenly felt very important. And I had this test run in private because I needed to know something before I said a single word to anyone. I needed to know if my daughter, the little girl this man just poured holy water over, was mine. Michael Grant's hand was actually trembling now as I placed the envelope in it. He didn't want to open it. I watched him understand, in real time, that whatever was inside that envelope, his congregation was going to watch him read it. Open it, I said. Everyone here just watched you announce a pregnancy with my wife in the middle of my daughter's baptism. I think they've earned the rest of the story. His hands shook so badly it took him 3 tries to get the seal open. He unfolded the single page inside. I watched his eyes move down the page once, then a second time, as though rereading it might change the result. I already knew what it said. I'd read it 100 times in the 2 weeks since I received it, sitting alone at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while Rachel slept upstairs, oblivious, planning a christening gift list. Nora was mine, fully, completely, unquestionably mine, not his, which meant the affair, however long it had actually been going on, had not been going on as long as it needed to for there to be any doubt. It meant Rachel had betrayed me, yes, but that my daughter was untouched by it, that she was entirely, biologically, undeniably my child, and that whatever Michael Grant had built in his head about being some secret second family patriarch had a hole blown straight through the middle of it. But I hadn't come there to prove she was mine. Everyone in that church already assumed that, and so had I, in my heart long before any lab confirmed it. I had come there to make Michael Grant say it out loud, in that sanctuary with his own trembling voice, in front of the same congregation whose respects he had spent years building his authority on. Read it, I said, out loud. Tell them what it says. He looked up at me, and for the first time in 6 years of knowing this man, I watched Michael Grant look genuinely, completely afraid. Ethan, he said quietly, you don't want to do this here. You did this here, I said. I'm just finishing it. His eyes went to the congregation, to the elders sitting in the second row, to Deacon Whitfield, who had chaired the finance committee for 11 years, to the dozen families whose children Michael Grant had baptized himself, whose weddings he had officiated, whose parents' funerals he had led. I watched him calculate in real time what silence would cost him versus what the truth would cost him. And I watched him understand there was no version of this morning where he walked out of that church with his reputation intact. It says, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, that Nora is Ethan's biological daughter. There's no question of paternity. Louder, I said. Not cruel, just steady. The people in the back didn't hear you. He repeated it, louder this time, his voice cracking on the word biological, and somewhere behind me I heard Rachel make a sound like the floor had opened beneath her. "Thank you," I said, and I took the paper back from his hands. Now, since we're being honest with everyone this morning, since apparently that's the theme of today's service, there's one more thing I think this congregation deserves to know, and it isn't about DNA. I hadn't planned to say this next part, not exactly. I had prepared for the paternity reveal, prepared for Rachel, prepared even for the pregnancy announcement, because my investigator had warned me 2 weeks earlier that Rachel had mentioned to a friend she might be further along than people think. What I hadn't planned on saying out loud in a church was the second file my investigator had handed me almost as an afterthought, the one about the building fund. "Pastor Grant asked this congregation 18 months ago to donate to a building expansion fund," I said. "Many of you gave generously. My own parents gave $4,000 toward it. I run a small accounting firm 3 blocks from here, and about 2 weeks ago, out of nothing more than professional curiosity after everything else I'd learned, I asked a colleague to pull the public filings on Grace Hollow's nonprofit finances." I paused. "There is no building expansion fund. There hasn't been a permit filed. There hasn't been a single contractor bid submitted in 18 months. There is, however, a joint account opened 9 months ago under Pastor Grant's name and an LLC registered to a lake property 40 minutes from here." The church erupted, not loudly, not chaotically, but in that low rolling murmur of 200 people all realizing something terrible at the exact same moment. Deacon Whitfield actually stood up from his pew. That account is for renovation contractors. That's completely," Michael Grant started. But his voice had lost every ounce of the confidence it carried 20 minutes earlier when he stood at this same altar announcing a pregnancy like it was good news. "Then you won't mind the Finance Committee reviewing it this week," I said, because I already sent copies of the filing discrepancies to Deacon Whitfield's email this morning, timed to arrive during the service. I looked at Whitfield, who was already pulling out his phone. "I imagine you have it now. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not do the financial digging out of some grand crusade for justice. I did it because once I stopped trusting my wife, I stopped trusting the ecosystem that had let this happen quietly for over a year. The whispers people must have half noticed and chosen not to say out loud. The Bible study calls at midnight nobody questioned because it was the pastor calling. The swelling collection plate nobody audited because auditing your pastor felt like a sin in itself. I wanted every lie in that building exposed on the same morning because I was done being the only person paying the cost of everyone else's comfortable silence." Rachel finally reached my side, grabbing my sleeve. "Ethan, please. Can we talk about this at home? Please, not like this?" I looked at her for a long moment. 6 years. A wedding in this same building. A daughter we had made together, whom I now knew with cold legal certainty was entirely mine. I thought about all the nights she came home smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine, and I told myself it was incense from the prayer group. I thought about how easily I had let her convince me my own instincts were paranoia. "No," I said, "we're not doing this at home. Home is where you've been lying to me for over a year. This is where you decided to make it public, in front of my daughter, in front of my mother, in front of the man who married us. So we're finishing it here." I turned back to the congregation, not raising my voice because I never needed to. "I'm not angry that people fall in love with the wrong person or make mistakes," I said. "I'm angry that both of you decided the best way to tell me was to let me find out standing in a church holding my daughter, surrounded by people who trusted you both completely. So here is what happens now. Rachel, you'll be served divorce papers this week. My attorney already has them prepared. And yes, I want full custody of Nora, which I don't think anyone in this room will find unreasonable, given what we all just witnessed. I turned to Michael Grant. And you, Pastor, can explain to your board of elders and possibly to a state auditor why a building fund became a lake house. I picked up my daughter from Carol's trembling arms. Nora blinked up at me, unaware of anything except the fact that her father's face was close to hers. And for one strange, quiet second, everything else in that sanctuary fell away. "I'm taking my daughter home," I said. "The rest of you can decide for yourselves what you do with what you just heard." I walked down that aisle with Nora against my chest and nobody stopped me. I heard my mother's footsteps behind me before I even reached the doors, and my business partner's voice saying something to Rachel's mother that I didn't stay to hear. That was 3 months ago. The divorce was finalized quickly, in part because Rachel's own attorney advised her that contesting custody after a paternity confirmation delivered in front of 200 witnesses following a public affair announcement at her own daughter's baptism was not a fight worth having. I have full custody of Nora now. Rachel sees her twice a month, supervised per the agreement, and I understand from people who still talk to me, though fewer of them talk to her now, that her relationship with Michael Grant did not survive the scrutiny either. Turns out, shared guilt doesn't hold two people together nearly as well as shared secrecy did. Grace Hollow Church removed Michael Grant from the pulpit 6 weeks later, after an internal audit confirmed exactly what I'd found. Nearly $90,000 redirected from congregation donations into private property over the better part of a year. He's facing a civil suit from the church board, and last I heard, criminal fraud charges were still being reviewed by the county prosecutor. The lake house, ironically, is now for sale. I still take Nora to church, actually. A different one, 20 minutes away, where nobody knows our story and the pastor is an 81-year-old man who's been married to the same woman for 53 years and has never once, to my knowledge, needed to open an envelope in front of his congregation. People ask me sometimes if I regret how I handled it. Whether I should have confronted Rachel quietly, kept it private, spared everyone the spectacle. I tell them the truth. I spent a year being quiet while she wasn't. I spent weeks gathering proof instead of screaming accusations I couldn't yet back up. And when the moment finally came, I didn't create the humiliation. I only made sure it landed on the people who'd earned it. If you've ever sat across a table from someone you loved, feeling a truth you couldn't quite prove yet, take it from me. Patience isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and losing everything twice. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more stories like this one still to come. Quiet men, patient men, who found out the truth long before anyone expected them to say a word.